It's March 31, 2006. A Friday night in Columbus, Ohio. Spring break is in full swing, and the bars near Ohio State University are packed with college students celebrating. Among them is Brian Schaefer, a second-year medical student who has every reason to be looking forward to the future. He's smart, well-liked, and just a week away from a vacation to Miami with his girlfriend. But Brian Schaefer will never make it to that trip. Because tonight, he's going to walk into a bar and never walk out. What makes Brian's disappearance so haunting isn't just that he vanished. It's that he vanished from a place with only one exit, covered by security cameras that recorded everyone who entered and left that night. Everyone except Brian. The footage shows him walking into the Ugly Tuna Saloon bar at 1:15 a.m. It never shows him leaving. And despite one of the most extensive investigations in Ohio history, no one has ever figured out how he simply ceased to exist. This is a story that defends logic and challenges everything we think we know about how people disappear. It's a case that has haunted investigators, tormented a family, and spawned countless theories ranging from the plausible to the impossible. And it all begins with a night that started like any other college evening but ended with a mystery that remains unsolved nearly 2 decades later. Before we dive deeper into what happened that night, if you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Share this with anyone who's fascinated by true mysteries. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Your engagement helps us bring more cases like this to light. Now let's continue with the events that led to one of America's most baffling disappearances. Brian Schaefer was 27 years old in March 2006. He wasn't your typical medical student burning out from stress. By all accounts, he was handling the pressure well, maintaining good grades while still finding time for a social life. He had a close relationship with his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, and they were planning their future together. He was close with his father, Randy, especially after the devastating loss of his mother to cancer just weeks earlier. Brian was grieving, certainly, but he was coping. He was moving forward. Or at least he was trying to. That Friday night, Brian met up with his friend William, Clint Florence. They planned to hit a few bars in the South Campus Gateway area, the kind of night out that thousands of college students have without incident. They started at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon, located on the second floor of a Gateway complex. The bar was crowded, music was loud, and Brian seemed to be in good spirits despite the recent loss of his mother. Security cameras captured him entering the bar, laughing with Clint, ordering drinks, talking to women. Everything appeared normal. Around 1:55 a.m., the cameras caught what would become the last verified footage of Brian Schaefer. He's visible talking to 2 young women near the bar's entrance. He's animated, smiling, gesturing as he speaks. Then he turns, appears to say something to the women, and moves back toward the interior of the bar. The camera loses sight of him. And that's it. That's the last time anyone can definitively prove Brian Schaefer existed. When the bar closed at 2 a.m., Clint couldn't find Brian. He assumed his friend had left early, maybe met someone, maybe just decided to call it a night. Clint went home. He wasn't worried. Why would he be? People split up at bars all the time. But Brian never came home. His girlfriend couldn't reach him. His father heard nothing. And when Brian didn't show up for work on Monday, people started to realize that something was very, very wrong. The police investigation began almost immediately, and what they discovered would baffle them for years to come. The Ugly Tuna Saloon had only one public entrance and exit, a single doorway accessed by an escalator. That doorway was covered by a security camera that recorded everyone who entered and exited the bar that night. Investigators reviewed every second of that footage. They could see Brian entering. They could see Clint leaving. They could see dozens of other patrons coming and going. But nowhere, in hours of footage, could they see Brian Schaefer leaving. It's physically impossible, and yet it happened. A grown man entered a building and never came out, despite the fact that every exit was monitored. This is the core mystery that has defined the case for 18 years. Because if Brian didn't leave through the door, where did he go? And more importantly, how did he vanish so completely that despite massive searches, psychic consultations, and FBI involvement, not a single trace of him has ever been found? When Brian's father, Randy Schaefer, reported his son missing on April 3, the Columbus Police Department initially treated it as a standard missing persons case. A young man in his 20s fails to come home after a night of drinking. It happened regularly. Most of these cases resolved within days when the person turned up hungover at a friend's house or sleeping off a bender somewhere. But Randy knew his son. Brian was responsible. He had work commitments. He had that Miami trip planned. He wouldn't just vanish without a word. The first thing investigators did was review the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon, and that's when they encountered the first major problem. Brian was clearly visible entering the bar at 1:15 a.m. Multiple cameras inside the bar showed him drinking, socializing, and appearing to have a good time. But when they reviewed the footage from the entrance camera, tracking every person who left between 1:15 a.m. and closing time at 2 a.m., Brian wasn't among them. He simply wasn't there. The police considered every possibility. Maybe he left during a gap in the footage? There were no gaps. The cameras ran continuously. Maybe he disguised himself somehow. They looked for anyone leaving who could possibly be Brian in different clothes or a hat. No matches. Maybe he left with a group and the camera angle obscured him. They tracked every group that left, identifying each individual. Brian wasn't among them. Maybe the timestamp was wrong. They verified the footage against other cameras in the area. The time was accurate. Detective John Hurst, who led the investigation, would later describe the footage analysis as one of the most frustrating experiences of his career. He knew what he was seeing made no logical sense. A person cannot enter a building through a single monitored entrance and then fail to exit through that same entrance without being recorded. It violated basic physical law. Yet that appeared to be exactly what happened. And the more they examined the footage, the more impossible it became. The police expanded their investigation. They interviewed everyone who had been at the Ugly Tuna that night. They talked to the two women Brian was seen speaking with in his last recorded moments. The women said Brian had been friendly, perhaps a bit drunk, but not stumbling or incoherent. He'd asked about their evening, made some jokes, and then excused himself to find his friend. They assumed he'd left with Clint. They didn't see anything suspicious. Clint Florence, Brian's friend who had been with him that night, became a person of interest simply by proximity. He was the last known person to see Brian. Police questioned him extensively. Clint's story never changed. They'd been bar hopping, ended up at Ugly Tuna. Brian was drinking but not excessively. They separated inside the bar, and Clint assumed Brian had left when he couldn't find him at closing time. Clint took a polygraph test. He passed. Investigators found no evidence suggesting he knew anything about Brian's disappearance. Then police considered the building itself. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was on the second floor of a complex. The main entrance was the only public way in or out. But there were service entrances, a loading dock, areas used by staff. Could Brian have left through one of those? They were all either locked, alarmed, or led to areas that would have required Brian to navigate through restricted spaces, down service corridors, past staff. The bar employees insisted no patron could have used those exits without being noticed. Still, investigators searched every inch of the building. They brought in cadaver dogs. They checked the roof access, the ventilation systems, storage areas, even the garbage chutes. They found nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. No indication Brian had ever been in any area outside the public bar space. It was as if he had literally evaporated into thin air somewhere between the camera losing sight of him at 1:55 a.m. and the bar closing 5 minutes later. The police also investigated Brian's personal life, looking for any reason he might have chosen to disappear. They examined his bank accounts. No unusual transactions. They checked his credit cards. No activity after March 31st. They pulled his phone records. The last call was made that evening before he went to the bar. They interviewed his girlfriend, Alexis. She was distraught, insistent that Brian would never leave voluntarily, especially not without telling her. Their relationship was strong. They were planning a future together. They talked to Brian's father, Randy, who was equally adamant. Yes, Brian had been grieving his mother's recent death. Yes, he'd been under stress from medical school. But Randy had seen his son regularly in the weeks before the disappearance. Brian was sad, certainly, but he was functioning. He was looking forward to the Miami trip. He was engaged with his studies. There were no signs of suicidal ideation, no indication he was planning to walk away from his life. The investigation broadened. Police canvassed the area around the South Campus Gateway. They talked to homeless individuals who frequented the area, thinking maybe someone had seen Brian leaving on foot. They reviewed footage from other cameras in the vicinity, trying to track where he might have gone if he had somehow left the building undetected. They found nothing. Brian Schaefer had effectively vanished from existence the moment the Ugly Tuna camera lost sight of him. As days turned into weeks, the case attracted media attention. Local news ran stories about the missing medical student. Brian's picture was everywhere. Tips started coming in. Someone thought they saw Brian at a rest stop. Someone else was sure they'd seen him at a concert. Every lead was investigated. Every sighting was tracked down. None of them panned out. The person at the rest stop was someone else. The guy at the concert looked nothing like Brian up close. The tips led nowhere. The Columbus Police Department brought in FBI assistance. Federal investigators reviewed the case files, examined the evidence, and reached the same frustrating conclusion. Brian Schaefer had entered the Ugly Tuna saloon and never left, which was impossible, which meant they were missing something crucial. But what? What were they not seeing? What piece of the puzzle would make this make sense? 1 month after the disappearance, police held a press conference. They asked anyone with information to come forward. They emphasized that Brian's family just wanted to know he was safe. If he had chosen to disappear, they respected that, but please, just let someone know you're alive. The plea went unanswered. Brian's phone never pinged another cell tower. His bank accounts remained untouched. His social security number was never used again. It was as if Brian Schaefer had been erased from the world. When the conventional investigation failed to produce answers, people began developing theories. Some were logical extensions of the known facts. Others ventured into territory that seemed to defy possibility. But in a case where a man vanished from a building he never left, maybe impossible theories deserved consideration. After all, something impossible had clearly happened. The first and most straightforward theory was that Brian left the bar through an exit that investigators hadn't properly considered. Perhaps there was a service entrance they'd overlooked. Maybe he'd convinced a staff member to let him out a back way. This theory had appeal because it didn't require anything supernatural or even particularly unusual. Just a missed detail. A door someone forgot to mention. But extensive searches of the building never revealed such an exit. Every door was accounted for. Every possible route out was monitored or secured. A variation of this theory suggested Brian left the bar in disguise. Maybe he swapped clothes with someone in the bathroom. Put on a hat, borrowed a jacket, walked out looking different enough that investigators didn't recognize him in the footage. But this theory requires believing Brian planned to disappear, which contradicted everything known about his life. His upcoming trip, his relationship, his career plans. Why would someone meticulously planning their disappearance then get drunk at a bar with a friend? Why risk being seen by dozens of witnesses? Some theorize that Brian had met with foul play inside the bar itself. Perhaps someone drugged him, incapacitated him, and smuggled his body out during the chaos of closing time. Maybe staff were involved, helping to conceal what happened. But again, this ran into the camera problem. Every person who left was recorded. Unless Brian's body was somehow hidden in a way that made it invisible to cameras and then removed during daylight hours, which seemed impossibly risky and complicated. The construction theory gained some traction for a while. The South Campus Gateway was undergoing renovation in 2006. There were construction areas, scaffolding, sections being remodeled. Some people suggested Brian might have wandered into a construction zone, had an accident, and his body was somehow sealed behind new drywall or concrete. This theory led to searches using ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing. And it still didn't explain how Brian accessed a construction area without being seen leaving the bar. Then there were the darker theories. That Brian had been targeted by someone, perhaps a serial killer who had been watching the bar. That he'd been lured away by someone he met, someone charismatic enough to convince him to leave through an unconventional exit. That something had happened in those final 5 minutes before the bar closed, something violent and quick, and the perpetrator had managed to conceal both the crime and the body with extraordinary efficiency. Some people looked at Brian's recent history and developed psychological theories. His mother had died just weeks before from cancer. Brian had been close to her. Maybe the grief was deeper than anyone realized. Maybe on that Friday night, after drinks lowered his inhibitions, Brian made a split-second decision to walk away from his life. To start over somewhere new where the pain of loss wasn't so overwhelming. But this theory struggled to explain the logistics. How did he leave the bar? Where did he go with no money, no car, no identification that was ever used again? The suicide theory was perhaps the saddest. That Brian, struggling with grief and the pressure of medical school, decided to end his life. That he somehow left the bar undetected and went somewhere to die, somewhere his body has never been discovered. Columbus has rivers. There are woods. There are places a person could disappear. But again, how did he leave the building? And why has no trace of him ever surfaced in 18 years? Bodies don't stay hidden forever, especially in populated areas. As the investigation dragged on with no breaks, some people began entertaining genuinely bizarre theories. That Brian had been abducted by a human trafficking ring. That he'd witnessed something criminal and been silenced. That he'd somehow gotten involved with dangerous people and been killed. But these theories all suffered from the same fundamental problem. They couldn't explain the central mystery. How did Brian Shaffer leave a building that he was never recorded leaving? One theory that investigators took seriously involved the possibility of Brian being in the witness protection program. Maybe he'd seen something, knew something, and federal agents had whisked him away that night for his own safety. It would explain the complete disappearance, the lack of any trace. But when police reached out to federal authorities, they were told there was no record of Brian Shaffer being in any protection program. It was a dead end. The band theory emerged from a strange detail. A week after Brian disappeared, his girlfriend Alexis received a call from his cell phone. She answered, but there was only static and background noise that sounded like music. The call disconnected after a few seconds. When police traced it, the call had come from Brian's phone, but the location couldn't be pinpointed. Some people theorized Brian was alive, possibly held against his will, trying to reach out. Others thought it was a technical glitch or someone who'd found Brian's phone. The call was never explained, and it never happened again. As the first anniversary of Brian's disappearance approached, his father Randy remained convinced that Brian was alive somewhere. He hired private investigators. He consulted psychics. He followed every lead, no matter how implausible. Randy's faith that his son would come home never wavered, even as the evidence suggested that Brian Shaffer was most likely dead. Whether from an accident, foul play, or suicide, the complete absence of any trace strongly indicated that Brian was gone. But the question remained. Where? Where was the body? Where was the evidence? In a modern American city with surveillance cameras, cell phone towers, and millions of people, how does a person vanish so completely? The theories multiplied, each trying to answer the impossible question. And none of them could fully explain what happened to Brian Shaffer on March 31, 2006. As the investigation progressed, attention inevitably turned to those closest to Brian. In missing persons cases, investigators always look at intimate relationships first. Statistically, if someone is murdered, there's a high probability the perpetrator is someone they knew well. So Alexis Waggoner, Brian's girlfriend, found herself under scrutiny she never expected and never fully escaped. Alexis and Brian had been dating for several years. By all accounts, their relationship was stable and loving. They'd met at Ohio State, bonded over shared interests, and built a life together. They talked about marriage. They planned futures. The Miami trip they were supposed to take in April was intended to be romantic, a chance to reconnect after the difficult period following his mother's death. Alexis appeared genuinely devastated when Brian vanished. Her grief seemed authentic. And yet, investigators had to ask the hard questions. Where was she the night Brian disappeared? Home, she said, sleeping. Did anyone verify that? No, she lived alone. Had they fought recently? They'd had minor disagreements, but nothing serious. Was the relationship in trouble? Not at all, they were closer than ever. Did she have any idea where Brian might have gone? None. Would he have left voluntarily? Never. She was adamant about that. Alexis cooperated with the investigation fully. She provided access to her phone records, her emails, her financial information. She sat for multiple interviews. She took a polygraph test and passed. By every measurable standard, she was a grieving girlfriend desperate for answers. But in the true crime community, and in certain investigative circles, suspicion lingered. Not because of evidence, but because of that statistical reality. When people disappear, loved ones are often involved. Some people pointed to small inconsistencies in her statements. Details that changed slightly between interviews, though nothing that seemed deliberately deceptive, more like the natural variation in how people recall events under stress. Others noted that she seemed to move on with her life relatively quickly. Within a year, she was dating someone new. Within 2 years, she'd married. To some, this suggested she knew Brian wasn't coming back. To others, it was simply a young woman trying to heal from trauma and build a future. The harshest critics noted that Alexis eventually stopped cooperating with investigators. Years into the case, she declined interviews. She refused to meet with new detectives reviewing the case. She moved on with her life and made it clear she wanted to leave the past behind. Some saw this as suspicious. If you truly wanted answers about your missing boyfriend, wouldn't you cooperate forever? But others understood it as self-preservation. How many times can you relive the worst moment of your life for investigators who never find answers? There's a particularly painful detail that fed suspicion. Brian's father, Randy, reportedly had a difficult relationship with Alexis after Brian's disappearance. Randy believed she knew more than she was saying. He never accused her directly of involvement, but he made it known that he questioned her version of events. This family tension added fuel to public speculation. If Brian's own father had doubts, didn't that mean something? But here's what the evidence actually shows. There is nothing linking Alexis to Brian's disappearance. No forensic evidence, no witnesses placing her at the scene. No financial motive. No history of violence in their relationship. No documented fights on the night he vanished. The polygraph she passed asked direct questions about her involvement, and the examiner found no deception. By every objective measure, Alexis Wagoner was exactly what she appeared to be. A girlfriend who lost someone she loved to inexplicable circumstances. The phone call from Brian's cell phone a week after he disappeared added another layer. When Alexis answered and heard only static and music, some people saw it as evidence Brian was alive and trying to reach her. Others suggested maybe Alexis knew where Brian's phone was because she knew where Brian was. But the call was traced and found to have originated from an area near the bar, not from Alexis's location. It proved nothing except that Brian's phone was still on, still capable of making calls, and in someone's possession. What makes Alexis's situation particularly tragic is that she became a suspect in the court of public opinion without any real evidence supporting that suspicion. She was guilty of nothing more than being the girlfriend of a man who vanished. And because the case remained unsolved, because no other clear suspect emerged, that association became permanent. To this day, discussions of Brian Schaefer's disappearance include speculation about Alexis, theories about what she might know, questions about why she stopped cooperating. The reality is probably much simpler and sadder. Alexis Wagoner was a young woman who lost her boyfriend to circumstances she didn't understand. She cooperated with investigators until it became clear they had no answers. She grieved. She moved on because that's what humans do when faced with unresolvable loss. And she chose to build a new life rather than remain frozen in the trauma of March 2006. That's not suspicious. That's survival. The attention on Alexis reflects a broader truth about unsolved cases. When conventional investigation fails, people look for someone to blame. They need the mystery to have a solution, even if that solution is based more on speculation than evidence. Alexis became a convenient target for that need. But being convenient doesn't make it true. And unless new evidence emerges, the most logical conclusion is that Alexis Wagoner is simply another victim of Brian Schaefer's disappearance. Not a perpetrator. A victim who lost someone she loved and then had to endure years of suspicion for a crime no one can prove even happened. If Alexis drew suspicion for being Brian's girlfriend, Clint Florence faced even more intense scrutiny for being the last person known to see Brian alive. Clint was with Brian that entire night. He was there when they bar hopped. He was there at the Ugly Tuna. And according to the timeline, he was one of the last people to see Brian before he vanished. That proximity made Clint both an invaluable witness and an inevitable suspect. Clint's account of that night has remained consistent across 18 years. He and Brian met up around 9 p.m. They went to a few bars in the area, having drinks, talking, watching the crowds. They ended up at the Ugly Tuna Saloon around 1:15 a.m. The bar was packed. They ordered drinks. They socialized separately, the way friends do in crowded bars. Clint said he last saw Brian around 1:55 a.m., talking to some women near the entrance. When the bar started closing and Clint couldn't find Brian, he assumed his friend had left, maybe met someone, maybe just decided to go home. Clint went home himself around 2 a.m. He didn't think anything was wrong. Why would he? People split up at bars constantly. He figured he'd talk to Brian the next day. But when Brian never came home, when he didn't show up to planned events, when his phone went unanswered, Clint realized something was very wrong. He contacted police. He cooperated fully. And then he found himself under investigation for his friend's disappearance. The scrutiny was intense. Police interviewed Clint multiple times, asking the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies. Where exactly did you last see Brian? What was he wearing? How drunk was he? Did he seem upset about anything? Did you fight? Did anything unusual happen? Clint answered everything. His story never changed in any significant way. He was at the bar with Brian. They separated. He left. He assumed Brian did too. That's all he knew. But to investigators, Clint's position was uniquely suspicious. He was the last known person with Brian. If something happened to Brian, Clint would have been present for it or immediately after it. The fact that Clint seemed so unconcerned when he couldn't find Brian at closing time struck some as odd. Wouldn't you be more worried about your friend? Wouldn't you search harder? Wouldn't you stick around to make sure he got home safely? Clint's response to these questions was simple. It was a college bar on a Friday night. People wandered off all the time. Brian was a grown man capable of taking care of himself. There was nothing about that night that seemed unusual or dangerous until Brian failed to turn up the next day. With hindsight, yes, Clint wished he'd looked harder. But in the moment, he had no reason to think anything was wrong. Police administered a polygraph test. Clint passed, showing no deception when asked if he knew what happened to Brian or if he'd been involved in his disappearance. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court and aren't foolproof, but investigators generally trust them as an investigative tool. Clint's clean result suggested he was telling the truth. Or at least that he believed he was telling the truth. Despite the polygraph, suspicion lingered in some quarters. People dissected Clint's behavior in the days and weeks after Brian vanished. He seemed sad but functional. He cooperated with police but also got on with his life. He spoke to media but seemed guarded. To skeptics, everything looked potentially suspicious. To others, it looked like a young man dealing with a traumatic situation as best he could. One detail that raised eyebrows was Clint's later refusal to take additional polygraph tests requested by Brian's father, Randy. Randy hired private investigators and wanted Clint to undergo more extensive questioning. Clint declined, reportedly on the advice of an attorney. To some, this refusal suggested guilt. Why wouldn't an innocent person submit to any test that might help find their friend? But others pointed out that Clint had already cooperated extensively with police, had already passed one polygraph, and had every right to protect himself legally when suspicion was being directed at him unfairly. The relationship between Clint and Randy Schaefer deteriorated significantly. Randy made it clear he believed Clint knew more than he was saying. Not necessarily that Clint had harmed Brian, but that something happened that night that Clint wasn't revealing. This tension played out in public to some degree, with Randy making statements that increased pressure on Clint, and Clint retreating further from public engagement with the case. From an outside perspective, Clint's situation seems impossibly difficult. He lost a friend to mysterious circumstances. He cooperated with authorities. He passed investigative scrutiny. And yet he remains under a cloud of suspicion nearly 2 decades later simply because he happened to be present. He can't prove he doesn't know what happened to Brian any more than he already has. The absence of evidence in his favor isn't evidence against him, but in the court of public opinion, the distinction doesn't always matter. What do we actually know about Clint Florence's involvement? We know he was with Brian that night. We know he was captured on security footage leaving the bar alone around 2 a.m. We know his statements to police have been consistent. We know he passed a polygraph. We know there's no physical evidence connecting him to Brian's disappearance. We know that his account of the evening matches what security footage shows. What we don't know is whether Clint saw or heard something that night that seemed inconsequential at the time but might have been important. Maybe Brian mentioned going somewhere. Maybe someone was paying too much attention to Brian. Maybe there was an interaction Clint dismissed but that held significance. It's possible Clint knows something without knowing he knows it. But that's very different from being involved in or responsible for what happened. The tragedy for Clint Florence is that his proximity to Brian's disappearance has defined his life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He was a friend spending a normal Friday night out, and it became the night that would haunt him forever. Whether he's treated fairly by public opinion is debatable. Whether he deserves suspicion based on available evidence is not. The evidence suggests he's exactly what he appears to be. A friend who was there when something inexplicable happened, and who has had to live with that coincidence ever since. Randy Schaefer's response to his son's disappearance was everything you'd expect from a loving father and more. He threw himself into finding Brian with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every lead was pursued. Every theory was considered. Every psychic claim was investigated. Randy wasn't going to let his son be forgotten, and he wasn't going to accept that Brian was simply gone without answers. In the immediate aftermath, Randy was everywhere. Media interviews, press conferences, working with police, distributing flyers. His message was consistent: Brian wouldn't just leave. Something happened to him. Someone knew something. And Randy was determined to find out what. His visible grief and desperate determination made him a compelling figure in the media coverage of the case. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, Randy's crusade began to take a toll. He hired multiple private investigators, each promising they could find answers the police couldn't. He spent thousands of dollars on searches, on rewards for information, on psychics who claimed they could locate Brian. Some of these efforts seemed reasonable. Others ventured into territory that concerned people close to him. Randy became particularly focused on the people closest to Brian. He questioned Alexis's account of events. He doubted Clint's version of the night. He believed that someone in Brian's inner circle knew more than they were saying, and if he just pushed hard enough, asked the right questions, offered the right incentive, the truth would emerge. This conviction put him at odds with both Alexis and Clint, relationships that deteriorated as Randy's suspicions grew. The tension between Randy and Alexis became particularly painful. Here were two people who both loved Brian, both wanted answers, but who found themselves on opposite sides of a divide. Randy saw Alexis as evasive. Alexis saw Randy as accusatory. The distance between them grew until they were barely speaking, and eventually not speaking at all. It was a secondary tragedy layered on top of Brian's disappearance. Randy's relationship with Clint followed a similar pattern. Initially, Randy was grateful for Clint's cooperation and presence that night. But as time passed and no answers emerged, Randy began to question everything about Clint's account. Why didn't he look harder for Brian? Why did he leave the bar? Why did he seem so calm? Why wouldn't he take additional polygraph tests? Randy wanted Clint to do more, to say more, to somehow provide the key that would unlock the mystery. The toll on Randy's own life was severe. He struggled to work. His health declined. His world contracted to a single focus: finding Brian. Friends and family worried about him, worried that the search was consuming him in ways that weren't healthy. But Randy couldn't stop. To stop searching would feel like abandoning his son. And he'd already lost his wife. He couldn't lose Brian too without exhausting every possibility. Randy's faith that Brian was alive somewhere sustained him through the early years. He convinced himself that one day, Brian would call or walk through the door. That this would all have some explanation that made sense. That it wasn't an ending but just a really difficult chapter. As long as there was no body, there was hope. And Randy clung to that hope with everything he had. Tragically, Randy Schaefer died in September 2008, just 2.5 years after Brian's disappearance. He died never knowing what happened to his son. His final years were consumed by grief, by unanswered questions, by a search that yielded nothing concrete. The case remained exactly as mysterious the day Randy died as it had been the day Brian vanished. It was a heartbreaking end to a father's crusade. Randy's death meant that the person most invested in finding Brian, the person driving much of the investigative effort, was gone. The case didn't close, but it lost its most passionate advocate. Police continued to follow leads as they emerged, but without Randy's constant pressure, without his willingness to fund private investigators and pursue every possibility, the momentum slowed significantly. Looking back at Randy's efforts, it's hard not to feel immense sympathy. He did everything a father could do. He spent his final years fighting for answers. And he died without getting them. Whether his suspicions about Alexis and Clint were justified or whether they were the product of grief-fueled desperation looking for someone to blame, we may never know. But his commitment to finding Brian was absolute. Randy's story is a reminder of how unsolved cases affect families. The not knowing is torture. The absence of answers prevents closure. You can't grieve properly because there's always the possibility, however remote, that your loved one might still be alive. Randy existed in that limbo for 2.5 years. Every day waking up wondering if today would be the day he'd get news. Every phone call carrying the possibility of breakthrough or heartbreak. His crusade also highlights the dangers of becoming too invested in theories without evidence. Randy's suspicions about people close to Brian strained relationships and created conflicts that didn't serve the investigation. It's understandable. When conventional approaches fail, you start looking for unconventional answers. But sometimes the search for someone to blame becomes destructive in its own way. Randy Schaefer died still believing his son was out there somewhere. Still believing his son was out there somewhere. Still believing that answers existed. Still hoping that one day, the mystery would be solved. That faith, maintained in the face of overwhelming evidence that Brian was most likely dead, is both heartbreaking and admirable. It was a father's love manifested as unwavering hope. And even though he never got the answers he sought, his determination ensured that Brian's case stayed alive, that people kept looking, that his son wasn't forgotten. Let's return to the central mystery that makes Brian Schaefer's case so uniquely frustrating. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was located on the second floor of the South Campus Gateway complex. To enter the bar, you took an escalator up from the ground floor. That escalator area was covered by security cameras. To leave the bar, you took the same escalator down. Those cameras recorded continuously throughout the night of March 31, 2006. Investigators have confirmed that Brian appears on camera entering the bar at 1:15 a.m. The footage is clear. You can see him, recognize him, track his movement through the entrance. He's wearing a light-colored shirt. He's with Clint. They're laughing, clearly in good spirits. This is the last undisputed sighting of Brian Schaefer entering any location. Inside the bar, additional cameras captured Brian at various points. Ordering drinks. Talking to people. The final footage shows him at 1:55 a.m. near the entrance, speaking with two women. He's animated, gesturing, clearly engaged in conversation. Then he turns back toward the interior of the bar, moving out of the camera's frame. And that's where the recording of Brian Schaefer's life ends. The bar closed at 2 a.m. Only 5 minutes passed between Brian's last appearance on camera and closing time. 5 minutes during which he should have left the building along with everyone else. Investigators reviewed every second of footage from that 5-minute window. They saw dozens of patrons leaving. They could identify each person, track their exit, see them descend the escalator. Brian wasn't among them. Then investigators expanded their review. Maybe Brian left earlier and they'd missed him somehow. They watched footage going back hours. Every person who entered was accounted for leaving, or was identified as someone who worked at the bar or neighboring businesses. Except Brian. They watched footage from after closing time. Maybe Brian passed out somewhere and left later when staff found him. The cameras showed staff leaving, security locking up, cleaning crews arriving in the morning. No Brian. The Columbus Police Department brought in video analysis experts. Maybe Brian had been edited out of the footage somehow, though that seemed absurdly complicated and would require access to the security system. The experts found no evidence of tampering. The footage was continuous and unaltered. Whatever happened to Brian, it didn't involve someone digitally removing him from the recordings. So if Brian didn't leave through the front entrance, what other options existed? This is where the building itself becomes crucial to understanding the mystery. The South Campus Gateway complex was relatively new in 2006, built as a modern mixed-use development. The Ugly Tuna Saloon occupied the second floor. Ground floor had retail spaces. Upper floors had apartments and offices. The architecture was straightforward, not some labyrinthine structure with hidden passages. The bar had service entrances used by staff and deliveries. These led to back corridors, stairwells, and eventually to loading areas on the ground floor. Police investigated whether Brian could have left through one of these service routes. The problem was access. The service doors were locked from the bar side, requiring staff keys to open. They were also alarmed in most cases, meaning opening them would have triggered alerts that night. No alarms were reported. Even if Brian somehow accessed a service corridor, he would have had to navigate through restricted areas, down back stairways, past locked doors, to eventually reach a loading dock or service exit to the outside. And he would have had to do this drunk, without being seen by any staff, and without triggering any security systems. It seemed virtually impossible, but in a case where the impossible had already happened, investigators had to consider it. They interviewed every staff member who worked that night. Bartenders, servers, security personnel, cleaning crews. Did anyone see Brian using a service entrance? Did anyone let him out a back way as a favor? Did anyone notice anything unusual in those final minutes before closing? The answer was consistently no. Brian wasn't seen in any staff-only areas. No one helped him leave through an alternative exit. He simply wasn't there. What about the construction? The South Campus Gateway was still completing some areas in 2006. There were spaces being finished, areas cordoned off for work. Some people theorized Brian might have wandered into a construction zone, perhaps while drunk and disoriented. Maybe he fell through an opening or accessed an area that later got sealed. Police searched these spaces thoroughly. They used ground-penetrating radar on walls. They checked behind newly installed drywall. Nothing. Could Brian have gone up instead of down? The building had roof access for maintenance. Maybe he went to the roof and then, what? Jumped? Fell? Was pushed? Investigators checked the roof. They looked for any evidence someone had been there that night. They searched the grounds around the building for any indication someone had fallen from height. Nothing was found. And again, how would Brian access the roof without being seen leaving the bar area? The ventilation system theory emerged from desperation. Could a person fit through the ductwork? Technically, in some sections, yes. Could a drunk person navigate a ventilation system, even if they could fit? Highly unlikely. Could they do it without making noise that would alert staff and patrons? Almost impossible. Could they exit the system somewhere without being seen? Where would they even exit to? The theory didn't hold up to scrutiny, but investigators checked anyway. The ductwork showed no signs of recent disturbance. Some people suggested Brian might have hidden inside the bar until after it closed, then left later. But the security footage would have captured anyone leaving after the bar closed. Staff did walkthroughs before locking up. They would have found someone hiding. And where would you hide in a bar that would escape a walkthrough? Under a table? In a bathroom stall? These spaces were checked. This theory didn't work. The freight elevator theory had some initial promise. The building had a service elevator used for deliveries and maintenance. Could Brian have taken this elevator to the ground floor and exited without being captured on the main entrance cameras? Investigators mapped this out. The elevator required a key to operate. It was located in a staff area Brian shouldn't have been able to access. And its ground floor exit was also monitored by cameras, albeit different ones. Those cameras showed no one matching Brian's description exiting that way. Then there was the possibility that Brian left through an attached business. The complex had multiple commercial spaces. Some shared walls or had connecting areas. Could Brian have somehow entered a neighboring business and exited through their entrance? Police investigated every business in the complex. None had connections to the Ugly Tuna that would allow easy access. None had any indication Brian had been on their premises that night. As investigators exhausted physical explanations, they were left with an inescapable conclusion. Based on the building's layout, the security systems, and the witness statements, Brian Schaefer should not have been able to leave the Ugly Tuna Saloon without being recorded. Yet he clearly did leave, because he wasn't found inside the building. So either something impossible happened, or investigators were missing something fundamental about the building, the footage, or the events of that night. 18 years later, people still debate the building mystery. True crime enthusiasts study the floor plans, watch the footage, try to find the exit Brian must have used. Someone even created 3D models of the complex, trying to visualize routes Brian might have taken. But no one has produced a definitive answer. No one has found the missing piece that explains how a man walked into a building and never walked out. The Ugly Tuna Saloon eventually closed. The South Campus Gateway complex still stands, but the bar is gone, replaced by other businesses. People who know the case sometimes visit, standing where the bar entrance used to be, trying to understand the mystery. They look at the escalator, imagine Brian ascending it, and wonder where he went. The building doesn't reveal its secrets. It just sits there, ordinary and unremarkable, concealing whatever truth exists about the night Brian Schaefer vanished. 1 week after Brian disappeared, something strange happened. His girlfriend Alexis received a call from Brian's cell phone. She saw his name on the caller ID and answered immediately, heart pounding with hope and fear. But there was no voice on the other end. Just static. And underneath the static, what sounded like music. Bar music, the kind of ambient noise you'd hear in a crowded venue. The call lasted only a few seconds before disconnecting. Alexis immediately called the police and reported it. Investigators traced the call. It had indeed come from Brian's phone. The location data placed the call originating from an area near downtown Columbus, close to where the Ugly Tuna Saloon was located. But beyond that general area, they couldn't pinpoint an exact location. The call was too brief for a precise triangulation. And then Brian's phone went dead again. No more calls. No more activity. Just silence. This single phone call has generated endless speculation. Was it Brian trying to reach out? If so, why didn't he speak? Was he injured, unable to communicate clearly? Was he being held against his will, only able to make a brief call before someone stopped him? Or was it someone else who had Brian's phone, accidentally dialing Alexis or deliberately taunting her with proof they had it? The music in the background suggested wherever the call came from, there was a social atmosphere. A bar, a club, a party. If Brian was alive and in such a place, why wouldn't he speak? Even if he was hurt or scared, you'd think he'd say something, anything. Just help or Alexis or some indication of what was happening. The silence suggested either he couldn't speak, or he wasn't the one who made the call. Some people theorized that Brian was alive but confused. Maybe he'd suffered a head injury during whatever happened that night. Maybe he had amnesia, didn't know who he was, but his muscle memory made him try to call his girlfriend. It sounds far-fetched, but in a case this strange, people grasped at any explanation. The phone call was proof of something. They just couldn't agree on what. Others suggested the call was accidental. Maybe someone had found or stolen Brian's phone. They were at a bar or party, the phone was in their pocket, and they accidentally but dialed one of the recent numbers. It happened to be Alexis. This theory explained the background music and the lack of speaking. It was just a random pocket dial. But if someone had Brian's phone, where was Brian? And why did the phone never show activity again after this single call? The more sinister interpretation was that someone was taunting Alexis. Perhaps whoever was responsible for Brian's disappearance wanted her to know they had his phone. The call was a message. "We can reach you. We have control." This seems unnecessarily risky. Why would someone trying to get away with a crime draw attention by making a call from the victim's phone? But human behavior isn't always logical, especially when it comes to crime. Police investigated the call thoroughly. They pulled records from the cell tower it pinged. They tried to determine if there were any nearby businesses or residences where someone might have been using the phone. They looked for any pattern that might indicate where Brian's phone had been since his disappearance. The data was frustratingly vague. The phone was in downtown Columbus. Beyond that, they couldn't say. The fact that Brian's phone was still on and functional a week later was significant. Modern cell phones have limited battery life. Even in 2006, a phone would typically die after a few days without charging. For Brian's phone to still be active a week later suggested someone was charging it. Or at least it had been charged at some point during that week. Which meant someone had the phone and was keeping it powered. But after this single call, the phone never showed any activity again. It didn't ping any cell towers. It didn't make or receive calls. It was as if after that brief moment of connectivity, it had been destroyed or discarded somewhere it would never be found. Police never recovered Brian's phone. It remains missing to this day, along with Brian himself. Alexis said that hearing the call, hoping it might be Brian, and then getting only static and background noise was one of the cruelest moments of the entire ordeal. For a few seconds, she thought maybe he was alive, maybe he was reaching out. Then the hope evaporated into confusion and continued uncertainty. The call answered nothing and raised a dozen new questions. Some investigators believed the call was genuinely accidental and meaningless to the investigation. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong number to focus on. Others thought it was the most significant clue they had. Proof that Brian's phone was still accessible, still in Columbus, still potentially traceable if they could just understand the circumstances of that call. But without more activity, without more data, the call remained an isolated mystery within the larger mystery. The phone call represents something that happens in many unsolved cases. A potential breakthrough that ends up leading nowhere. A tantalizing piece of evidence that seems like it should mean something but ultimately reveals nothing concrete. It gives hope, then takes it away. It suggests possibilities without confirming any of them. And it leaves everyone involved more frustrated than they were before. For those who believe Brian is alive somewhere, the phone call is evidence supporting that theory. He was trying to reach out. He was somewhere near downtown. Maybe he's been living off the grid, occasionally surfacing in ways that are detected but never fully explained. For those who believe Brian died that night, the phone call is just someone with his phone, intentionally or accidentally making a call that meant nothing. The truth about the phone call, like so much else in this case, is probably something we'll never know with certainty. It happened. It was traced to a general location. And then it became just another unexplained detail in a case full of them. One more question mark in a story that has far more questions than answers. In the months and years following Brian's disappearance, there were numerous reported sightings. People called police claiming they'd seen Brian at a gas station, on a street corner, in another city, sometimes even in other states. Each report had to be investigated. Each one offered a flicker of hope. And each one ultimately led nowhere. The first major sighting came just days after Brian vanished. A woman called police saying she'd seen someone matching Brian's description at a rest stop along Interstate 70, heading west out of Ohio. She was certain it was him. The man was acting strangely, she said, seemed confused or disoriented. Police responded immediately, reviewing security footage from the rest stop, interviewing staff. The man the woman described wasn't Brian. Similar features maybe, but definitively not him. Another sighting placed Brian in Hilton Head, South Carolina, months after his disappearance. The person who reported it was adamant. They'd seen Brian at a beach bar. He was thin, tanned, looked different, but it was absolutely him. They even claimed they'd tried to approach him and he'd walked away quickly. Investigators followed up. They showed Brian's photo to bar staff. They checked local hotels and guest registries. No trace of Brian was found. The person who was spotted looked vaguely similar to Brian, but wasn't him. These patterns repeated. Someone thought they saw Brian in Florida, in Texas, in California. Each time, investigators did due diligence. They checked surveillance footage when available. They interviewed witnesses. They showed photos. And each time, the sighting was either mistaken identity or couldn't be verified. It's surprisingly easy to think you recognize someone when you're looking for them, when you've seen their face in media coverage, when your brain wants to find them. One particularly compelling sighting came from a woman who said she'd sat next to someone who looked exactly like Brian on a flight from Columbus to Los Angeles in 2007. She said the man seemed nervous, kept to himself, refused to make eye contact when she tried to talk to him. She reported it as soon as she landed. But when investigators pulled the flight manifest and reviewed airport security footage, there was no record of Brian Schaefer being on that flight. The man she sat next to was identified and wasn't Brian. The sightings highlighted a psychological phenomenon that occurs in high-profile missing persons cases. People genuinely believe they see the missing person. It's not that they're lying or seeking attention. Their brains, primed with images of the missing person and a desire to help, pattern match faces they encounter. Someone has similar hair, similar build, wears clothes the same way, and suddenly the brain says that's him. The certainty can be overwhelming, even when it's wrong. For Brian's family, especially his father Randy while he was alive, each sighting was emotionally devastating. The call would come in. Hope would surge. Maybe this was finally the break they needed. Then investigators would follow up and the sighting would fall apart. The person wasn't Brian. Or couldn't be confirmed. Or was provably somewhere else at that time. The cycle of hope and disappointment was torture. Some sightings seemed almost cruel in their specificity. People would call saying they'd not only seen Brian but had spoken with him. He'd told them his name was Brian. He'd mentioned going to Ohio State. He'd said things that seemed to confirm his identity. But when investigators dug deeper, these stories never held up. Either the person couldn't produce the witness who'd supposedly spoken to Brian, or the details they provided didn't match, or there was no physical evidence supporting the encounter. The internet era made the sighting phenomenon worse. People would post on message boards that they'd seen Brian. Others would share these posts. Soon you'd have multiple people claiming the same sighting, creating an echo chamber that amplified an initial mistaken identification. Investigators had to wade through this noise, trying to separate legitimate tips from internet rumors and attention-seeking. One particularly sad aspect of the sightings was how they prevented closure. As long as people kept reporting that they'd seen Brian, as long as there was even a remote possibility he was alive somewhere, his family couldn't fully grieve. They existed in limbo, unable to move forward because what if the next sighting was real? What if Brian really was out there, and giving up meant abandoning him? By around 2010, the frequency of sightings decreased significantly. Brian's face wasn't in the media as much. The case was older news. People moved on to other mysteries. The occasional report still came in, someone who'd watched a documentary or read an article and then thought they saw Brian somewhere. But the wave of constant sightings from the first few years had ended. Not a single sighting has ever been confirmed. Not one has produced any evidence that Brian Shaffer was alive after March 31, 2006. No photo captured by the person reporting the sighting. No credit card transaction in Brian's name after he was supposedly spotted. No hotel registration. No hospital admission. Nothing tangible to support any of the hundreds of reported sightings. What the sightings demonstrate is how desperately people wanted Brian to be found. Both strangers who'd heard about the case and felt compelled to help, and family members who needed to believe their loved one was still alive. The human brain is remarkably good at finding patterns, even when those patterns don't exist. We see faces in clouds.